Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great honor to be here. I'd like to start this afternoon with a Midwestern metaphor. Anybody here from the Midwest? All right. I was born in Missouri, just downstream from where the mighty Missouri and Mississippi rivers join. And as I thought about today's event, flying west across the country earlier this week, I was reminded of the confluence of two great forces that can have a profound impact on global poverty. The first force is small and growing businesses, which account for the vast majority of jobs, new jobs in wealthy nations, but only a sliver of the economy in developing countries. And the second force is agriculture, which is the primary activity, economic activity for most of the poorest people in the world, and yet generates just barely enough for farm families to scrape by. Of the 2.6 billion people living on less than $2 a day, 75% are in rural areas, and the World Bank estimates that growth in the agricultural sector is twice as effective in reducing global poverty than growth in any other sector. So given what we know about small and growing businesses and agriculture, how do we unleash the power of these forces to address global poverty and to transform rural communities throughout Latin America, Africa, and Asia? Now, to begin answering that question, I'd like to take you back 12 years or so to a vanilla field in southern Mexico. So I was sitting on the ground and I could hear squawking parrots and the rush of a river nearby, and many hours in the back of a pickup truck had landed me in the heart of the Chimalapas jungle. Sitting beneath the forest canopy were about 100 vanilla growers from an association of Zoque indigenous farmers who'd gathered to hear their leader, who was standing atop a very large tree stump. "We organized ourselves," he shouts. "We kicked out the narco-ganaderos and took back our land and our forest. It hasn't been easy, but we built our cooperative. We will reach the markets. We will make money for our families and communities." And as I listen to this guy rally the farmers, my mind turns to Manhattan. About a year earlier, I had traded my job on Wall Street for a business journalism fellowship, which took my wife and me on a 2-year journey across rural Mexico. And before we left New York City, I went and visited a longtime development practitioner who'd spent years living in rural Latin America. And he said, "Mark my words, Willy, you will meet leaders in very remote places with just as much sense of purpose and poise and leadership talent as any congressman or CEO." Now, back in the Chimalapas, those words reverberated in my head, and I thought about the scores of leaders I'd met across Mexico, typically managers of farmer and artisan associations, most with little to no formal business training, but many accidentally, yet passionately dedicating their lives to build competitive enterprises in the countryside. And so, among the poverty, the migration, deforestation, drug trafficking, there was enormous potential. And yet, sadly, that vanilla cooperative failed. Without access to credit or the ability to manage, the financial skills to manage the enterprise, it could not match the odds stacked up against it. And so, in the ensuing months, as I traveled across Mexico, I thought about how could one change that outcome? How could we provide access to capital and capacity building to that vanilla cooperative and others like it? After all, these businesses had products that consumers wanted. Starbucks and Whole Foods were on the rise. Americans were discovering organic and fair trade and a whole host of green seals and social labels and certifications. But farmer associations and or private enterprises that might aggregate several hundred or a few thousand smallholder farmers or artisans are too big for microfinance, and yet they're still too small, too risky, too remote for the banks. So they're caught in the missing middle. And without access to capital, they can't grow their operations, they can't invest in productive infrastructure, they can't even pay the farmers on time. In short, they can't realize their potential to move rural populations out of poverty. So now let me skip ahead a number of years and take you down to Peru to see how one might address that gap in the capital markets, this missing middle of rural finance. Now, Quinacho is a cooperative of about 550 cocoa farmers that's located in a region of northern Peru that, like the Chimalapas, is mired in a struggle against drug production. In this case, coca, which is the main ingredient for cocaine. In 2006, Quinacho couldn't get a loan from any local bank. Root Capital made a $50,000 loan that year for the purchase, processing, and export of specialty cocoa to European markets. 4 years later, Quinacho's revenues have soared to $4 million. Root Capital's loan has grown to $1 million. Quinacho now has several other financing sources. Meanwhile, farmer income has grown to $7,000 per household, which is way above the poverty line and a legitimate alternative to the drug trade. Quinacho is representative of the challenges that most of our clients face and how we get around them. It turns out there are a number of good reasons why banks wouldn't lend to Quinacho. The first, they're in a region that's prone to roadblocks and violence, and that's not a good thing for a business whose revenue depends on getting product from the mountains to the port. Second, they're about a 7-hour drive from the regional capital, and for a local investment officer at a bank in town, that's a tall order when they've got less risky businesses right down the street. Third, they have little in the way of formal collateral to offer the banks. Often it's no more than machinery like that and few land titles. Fourth, banks typically are simply afraid to lend in agriculture because of real and perceived risks. And lastly, the manager of Quinacho didn't go to one of the elite universities in the country. And we may snicker at this one, but in Latin America, for instance, about a third to half of the population lives in the capital city, where the urban elite go to maybe one of 2 or 3 universities. And so if you go to the Managua airport, it sometimes feels like a family reunion, like a college reunion. And so that network through university comes very much in handy when you're doing business, and that network's not available to these farmers. So how and why did Root Capital make that loan to Quinacho? Well, the fellow on the right, one of our Peruvian investment officers, Daniel Rivera, spent much of a day in a bus traveling to Quinacho. And then he spent another day and a half with the manager and the board of directors of the cooperative. And he saw in Quinacho what we see in dozens and dozens of other organizations. Committed farmers, trusted leaders, and a high-quality product that the market wants. Meanwhile, Quinacho's buyers in Europe wanted a more reliable supply, and they were willing to work with us. So the purchase agreement with Quinacho, in effect, became or replaced the need for traditional collateral. So when product shipped, Root Capital got paid back directly by the buyer. And then we deducted the principal and the interest and then returned the remainder to Quinacho. So nothing fancy here. No big innovation. Just basic financial and business analysis and building relationships and trust up and down the value chain, the supply chain. Now, like many of you here in the room, Root Capital forms part of this emerging field of social enterprise, where there's a lot of talk about big new innovations, but often the solutions are actually pretty straightforward. David Bornstein, who wrote one of the authoritative books on social enterprise, published a piece in the New York Times recently where I think he put this point well. He said, success in addressing challenges of global poverty. He wrote, quote, "Hinge on less on big new ideas than on collections of small, old ideas, well integrated and executed." And so along those lines, I'll let you in on a little secret amongst us social entrepreneurs, which is identifying the problem and founding an organization to address it is the easy part. It's much harder to build an organization that can address that problem at scale. And on that front, it really boils down to it's about people. And in our case, recruiting, retaining talent that has technical and finance expertise, but that also shares a deep, deep commitment to our work. And we talk a lot about being multilingual in boardrooms and on back roads and beat-up buses. But we've learned the hard way that it's a lot easier to teach the technical skills, the hard skills, than it is to teach values and empathy. Which brings me to all of you here in the audience, especially the students who are thinking about what's next on the horizon. How do we as individuals find our paths? And I say we because these career decisions repeat themselves throughout our lives. One of the most frequent questions that we get asked at events like this from students is, should I go into social enterprise now, or should I go into the corporate sector, build up my expertise, more experience, and then have an even bigger impact later on? And of course, there's no right answer to that. There really isn't. These are very personal decisions. But I thought I might respond by picking up quickly on my experience, my story about 12 years ago. So not long after meeting the vanilla farmers in the Chimalapas, I got into business school. And coming back from Mexico after my time in southern Mexico in the late 1990s, the experience of working with the farmers was so fresh, and kind of the immediacy of their needs was so acute that I really couldn't imagine doing anything else. I suppose it was a combination of intuition and impatience that I was just afraid that I would lose the urgency. And so I decided to ditch business school. One last thing, the internet frenzy at that time was at its height, and MBA students, you'll recall from around the country, were flocking to Silicon Valley. And from where I was coming, that was a different place from where I wanted to go. So I ditched business school and decided to give this a shot. My wife went on to get her MBA, so hope she'll make us very wealthy. The internet, by the time she graduated, the internet bubble had almost burst. We were close to having our first child, our daughter Charlotte. And I had convinced our first hire to come on board. And we've been building Root Capital ever since. And a few years after our launch, when we realized that Root Capital wasn't going to crash and burn before its infancy, one of our board members said to me, Willy, naivete is a strategic advantage, because if you had any idea what you're getting into, you never would have done it. And so we've benefited from plenty of strategic naivete over the years, no question. And with hindsight, there are a few things that I probably would have done differently. But on the decision to go with my gut and found Root Capital, I do it again every time. And now, 10 years later, as the CEO of Root Capital, I get to wear a lot of different hats. And I'd say one of the most important ones, and I'll conclude here, is guardian of our culture. I have a guitar, Dave Peary knows this, hanging on the wall of my office, and I look for any excuse, a birthday, a staff meeting, a field visit to sing and play with our team and with our clients. And so I don't want you to be shocked, but I wanted to end with a short ballad today that's particularly apropos, I believe, to the topic of what it means to live an innovative life. So here it goes. How many times have you heard someone say, if I had his money, I could do things my way. But money won't buy back your youth when you're old, a friend who's departed, or a love that's grown cold. How little they know that it's so hard to find one rich man in 10 with a satisfied mind. So here's to having a satisfied mind. Thank you. Here's to having a satisfied mind and playing and changing the world at the same time. And just quickly, this is a picture of me in Rwanda, where I was a number of years ago, and I was asked by one of the farmers to play Nicaraguan revolutionary folk songs. Somebody from the Green Mountain Coffee Roasters there told them that I did that, and so I did, and sure enough, next thing I know, cameras are rolling, because the Minister of Agriculture was there at this, in this village. And the next day, I'm in downtown Kigali, and a stranger runs up to me and says, "I saw you on national television yesterday." So this was my 15 seconds of fame in East Africa. Thank you all very much.